When we think about the global muckrakers, one of the questions we ask ourselves is when their reporting made a difference and when it didn't. A time when journalism can have a huge impact is when journalists tell the world about famines. In many places in the world, journalistic coverage of famines, especially photos and television footage, has raised the alarm and kept pressure on governments to act. Seeing stark photos of starving children gets the attention of the world. Citizens send in donations. Governments and relief agencies are pushed to provide food and other forms of emergency relief. Governments often do not want to publicize the existence of food shortages for many reasons, so aid agencies and non-governmental organizations spend a lot of time thinking about their communication strategies. In this section, we take a look at the case of the global muckraker Ian Stevens and the 1943 Bengal Famine. His coverage not only led to an immediate humanitarian response, but it also gave rise to a new form of academic scholarship on media effects. Part of why the newspaper's coverage was so effective was because there was an immediate problem with a solution. People were starving and they needed food. The Statesman was an English-language broadsheet founded in Calcutta in 1875 and incorporated the newspapers The Englishman and Friend of India. In the 1940s, its editor was a British journalist named Ian Stevens. Bengal was an area that was known for periodic famines. Although historically it was an area with a lot of agriculture, under British rule, the region had had terrible famines in 1770 and 1873. India was a British colony. The British had put laws in place in the late 19th century that were supposed to prevent famines from happening. By classifying food shortages, the famine codes were intended to predict when famine was going to take place so that it could be stopped. We know from the writing of Madhusri Mukherjee and others that the 1943 Bengal famine was triggered by a terrible typhoon in Bengal in 1942. The typhoon destroyed crops and aggravated a scarcity of rice in rural areas. This scarcity was caused by several war-related factors, in particular runaway inflation and hoarding, as well as a scorched earth policy intended to ward off a feared invasion by Japan. A loss of imports of rice from Burma and Thailand worsened the situation. To alert the public to what was happening, Stevens began using the Statesman to sound the alarm. Although he describes himself as inexperienced and naive, he says that somehow he did the right thing. In this passage from his memoirs, Monsoon Morning, Stevens describes how he and his colleagues began to not just report on what was happening, but to consciously try to push the government into doing something. Looking back, I see myself as stumbling into doing the right thing about the famine at the right time, vigorously, and indeed soon with passionate humanitarian zeal, almost by accident. That we emerged not merely with credit, but with the editor in the Bengali public's eyes somewhat haloed, is somewhat surprising. At the time, India was under wartime censorship restrictions imposed by the government of India. Reporting on the famine was forbidden. Information about food supplies was considered valuable intelligence that could aid the enemy. Local newspapers in vernacular languages covered the food shortages. The widespread hunger was described in Communist Party pamphlets. Artists depicted it in paintings and drawings. But mainstream newspapers such as Amrita Bazar Patrika and The Statesman, while extensively covering the parliamentary debates and discussion about food supplies, held back on their famine reporting for most of 1943. Finally, Stevens and his colleagues could take it no longer. They ratcheted up the tone of the Statesman's editorials, blasting the government of India for not doing enough. More powerfully, the Statesman published shocking photos of the families and children who had streamed into Calcutta looking for food. The second batch of photos, published on August 29th, came with this quote that reminded readers that the paper felt a responsibility to keep after the government until something was done. We published them with reluctance and after anxious thought, believing that to do so is unavoidably our duty. Confronted this year with numerous examples of maladministration in the empire's second city, it has been our experience that until they are discussed in the press, nothing is done. As a foreigner editing a newspaper targeted to the elite colonizer, Stephens and his colleagues knew they would be able to publish what their local colleagues could not. They followed up with harder-hitting editorials, including the famous The Death Roll, published on October 16th, which blasted the government. Once the mainstream English-language newspaper had broken the government's wall of silence, others followed. Although it still tried to downplay the numbers, the government was forced to admit what was happening. The story went international and was covered in the US papers as well as the wire services. The famine was debated in the British Parliament. 80,000 tons of wheat and 130,000 tons of barley reached India in November of 1943. But it was not enough. The famine was not finally fully relieved until Bengal's own food crop came harvested at the end of December. Even that, however, came too late for the millions who had died. Some estimate the number of dead at around 1.5 million people, but the more commonly accepted number of dead is 3 million people. It was a tragedy for Bengal and a disgrace for His Majesty's government. Stephens credited the statesman's efforts with forcing the government to act. If the statesman had not kept up the editorials and published the terrible and dramatic photos, the government would have continued on its path. The experience of the statesman in Bengal in 1943 changed how people think about the causes of famine and also about the role of media in preventing famine and causing government to act once famines have started. Because of what happened in Calcutta, Nobel laureate economist Amartya Sen, who is known for his work on development and entitlement theory, developed ideas about the causes of famine and the role of access to food. His thinking about how entitlement to food as a main reason for famine, not food shortages, was an important development in ideas about famine. Sen not only transformed the way people think about the causes of famine, but he also pioneered contemporary ideas about the role of the media. Sen gave the Coromandel lecture in 1982 in India and argued that democracies like India would never have terrible famines such as the ones seen in China after the Great Leap Forward, because having a free press would stop famines from happening. The media would serve as an early warning system and would keep up the pressure on government to act. Economists Timothy Besley and Robin Burgess looked at local language media in India. They found that in areas where there were more newspapers, government response to natural disasters, including food shortages and floods, was much faster and stronger than in other parts of India where there were fewer newspapers. And so a school of thought about the importance of the media was born. What are some of the lessons we can learn from Ian Stephens and the Statesman about when does muckraking journalism make a difference? It often takes more than one piece of journalism to make a difference. Staying with a story is essential. It took months of reporting and dramatic photos to finally push the government of India to react. Sometimes an outsider is freer to report. In the case of Stephens, as a British journalist editing an English language paper, he felt and was freer than the Indian journalists. He also had an audience that included elite government officials. These were the people that needed to be shamed into taking action. Once the story broke, then other news outlets could cover it, and they did. It sometimes takes one journalist to cover something before others will chime in. That piling on of the media is essential. It's hard for one piece of journalism to bring about change. More coverage from more outlets can lead to more and faster action. There was an institution that could act when pushed. The government of India cared about its reputation. It needed the support of its colonial subjects. The government would lose legitimacy if it was seen as unable to govern effectively. One of the arguments for the British colonial presence was they could do good things for India. If the government let people starve, then that justification no longer worked. Colonialism would be once again called into question. There has been a lot of scholarship about the role of the media covering natural disasters and famine, and how exposing these tragic effects can force governments to step in and help. Around the world, there has been extraordinary global muckraking on these subjects, but not many people outside of India know the story of the Bengal media and the role of Ian Stevens and the statesman.